Die Völker wollen nicht mehr auf den Schlachtfeldern sterben, damit diese wurzellose internationale Rasse an den Geschäften des Krieges verdient und ihre alttestamentarische Ratio befriedigt. Über der jüdischen Parole, Proletarier aller Länder, vereinigt euch!
Adolf Hitler has come to completely change the lives of Germans. Promises of prosperity seemed to materialize immediately after taking power in 1933. The nation rises from the ashes, or at least that is what Nazi propaganda shows. Sectors that supported the regime began to enjoy economic benefits, but someone has to pay for it. The persecution of different groups grows more and more. However, the main victim is the Jewish people. That illusion of a flourishing country serves to hide part of the enormous dictatorship that is consolidating at the head of Germany. Education is now a not-so-discreet camouflage for indoctrination. The fear of repression is the preferred tool for controlling those who oppose the Fuhrer. Military rearmament is the ultimate goal. Hitler is preparing people for war, and the entire population is blindly following him. In this new military history video, we will walk through the German streets during the Third Reich to discover how people lived. We will learn about the suffering of the less fortunate and why the Nazi leader received so much support for his dream of building a new empire.
For most Germans, these were good years, a time of growing prosperity. Hitler's Nazis had promised national revival, and they boasted enormous popular support.
Before the outbreak of World War II, life in Nazi Germany was marked by a radical transformation in almost every aspect of society. However, even though we may now think of it in a negative light, as it was a totalitarian and racist dictatorship, the population at that time viewed it in a positive light. A crucial aspect that influenced this view was the country's economic growth. During his political campaign, Adolf Hitler managed to reach large crowds by using people's anger over the defeat in World War I and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. This agreement was signed by rulers around the world to end the conflict, held Germany responsible for the conflict, and punished the country severely. Through it, the nation lost more than 10% of its territory, and its army was reduced to 100,000 men. In addition, it was prohibited from recruiting new soldiers, and most of its weapons were confiscated. Finally, he was fined heavily, leaving his finances in ruins. The Fuhrer channeled the anger of the Germans over the harsh penalty and took advantage of it. He made them a promise. The German people would prosper. To the surprise of some, when he won support to take over the government, he kept his word. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler took power, and over the next 6 years, the standard of living of the population improved considerably. The Third Reich obtained funds through a combination of confiscated property from Jews and loans taken out abroad. Thanks to this, it generated various public works projects, such as the construction of schools and hospitals. This policy served to create millions of jobs and achieve a substantial drop in unemployment in the country. While this represented an achievement in itself, it also sought to provide help to the Germans by granting loans or reducing taxes. From these benefits, the Germans could go on vacation, buy modern domestically manufactured cars, or access new technological wonders such as television. The population was happy with the progress that had been achieved and reflected this with unconditional support for the Fuhrer, their hero, their savior.
Bubbling enthusiasm. It was contagious. One woman turned to me, a perfect stranger, and said, "He is my mother and my father. He keeps me safe from all harm."
Germany in these years was gripped in a cult of the Fuhrer, the leader. The Nazis urged Germans to put their differences aside, to rally behind Hitler.
The kind actions of the state continued to accumulate in different areas, while the affection for Hitler increased. The regime encouraged outdoor activities and subsidized all kinds of sports. There was even a government organization dedicated to leisure, with proposals for adults and children. The family was the central value of the Nazi universe: father, mother, and if possible, many children. That was what was going to ensure the greatness of the nation. With this in mind, the Third Reich also included loans on favorable terms for newlyweds, which substantially increased marriages. Along with this, particularly prolific women were rewarded with medals and financial benefits. However, those who did not meet the standards of the supposed pure race that Nazism promoted suffered another fate.
Diary, Berlin, December the 10th, 1935. The Genetic Health Act, or sterilization law, has been passed and envisages extensive examinations and tests for engaged couples before they get married. If things continue like this, we'll soon have a race of supermen. So far, there is no sign of this happening.
This regulation was key to the regime. Through the so-called Nuremberg laws, the first thing that was sought was to prohibit marriages between Aryans and Jews or any other person belonging to groups considered inferior. Following that, only German women considered pure were encouraged to reproduce en masse. Meanwhile, Hebrews, Gypsies, disabled women, or those belonging to other circles called undesirable, were subjected to forced sterilizations. This was part of a broad eugenics program implemented by the Third Reich, which sought to eliminate the transmission of certain genes within the population. The Nazis dreamed of being able to control the offspring that would dominate the world once they rebuilt the German Empire. But for that to happen, it was necessary for the Aryan race to unite in order to procreate quickly. A peculiarity about the incentives we talked about earlier was that of the awards. On August 12th of each year, coinciding with Hitler's mother's birthday, the Fuhrer himself awarded the most prolific women the Cross of Honor. It was bronze for those who had more than 4 children, silver for those who had more than 6, and gold for those who had more than 8. Likewise, the 10th child of a pure German woman was sponsored by the Nazi leader and had to be named Adolf. Now, beyond the fact that many felt honored to contribute to their country, there were several other aspects that influenced the lives of the nation's mothers. Sterilizations were not the only way in which the government controlled female sexuality. The state promoted chastity before marriage and severely punished adultery, especially among non-Aryan groups of people. On the contrary, those women who met the parameters of racial purity were often taken to establishments where they were forced to have sex with an SS soldier to become pregnant and strengthen the people. The Third Reich exercised dictatorial control. But Germans who saw the economic benefits and were enthralled by Hitler's nationalist rhetoric turned a deaf ear to the suffering of minorities. During the early years, even people in neighboring countries such as Poland recognized the government's work and moved to Nazi soil.
I come to Germany convinced that the overwhelming majority of the people don't find the political system of the Third Reich unjust or harmful. On the contrary, I'm convinced that many millions of people are profiting from Hitler's victory. Above all, unemployed people and everyone whose life is filled with national pride. I'm convinced that the system has indeed taken away certain moral values from people, but in its place has brought material advantages.
This view is a clear example of how the population accepted everything that happened around them. In line with the role that women occupied, the slogan that encapsulated the Nazi vision was Kinder, Küche, Kirche. The first word translates as children and refers to their aforementioned obligation to have and raise children. The second means kitchen and speaks of the fact that they had to take care of the home and domestic chores. The last is church, since German women had to maintain a moral and religious life within the values of Christianity. For Hitler, women could not be part of the Nazi Party or have a job. Their political or public participation was considered inappropriate. He encouraged even professional women to leave their positions so that they could be occupied by men. In this way, they should only dedicate themselves to the proliferation of the race. As expected, in the midst of a regime that knew how to use propaganda as its most powerful weapon, organizations were created for the indoctrination of the new generations. There, both young women and men were actively recruited to promote National Socialist ideology and reinforce each other's traditional roles.
The Germans adore military show. In Nazi Germany, everyone has a uniform. If it isn't the uniform of the Army, Navy, or Air Force, it is that of the SA, SS, or some party organization. Even the little boys and girls have been strutting about in the uniform of the Hitler Youth or the Union of German Girls.
In the case of the female groups, women were taught how to do household chores and the importance of being wives and mothers loyal to the regime. Nazi values were also instilled in young girls, and they were prepared for their future. Meanwhile, the Hitler Youth aimed at boys had another focus. This was a movement driven by the Fuhrer's party, which sought to indoctrinate the next generations to perpetuate the 1,000-year Reich. That was the National Socialist vision, which thought of centuries and centuries of German domination worldwide. And to achieve this, it was necessary to place special emphasis on young people as the leaders of tomorrow. Given this, the teaching focused on militancy of ideals, physical training, racial concepts, and absolute obedience to Hitler. This movement was something more than just a German version of the Boy Scouts, and it soon became the entry of youth into a military life. The Nazi leader knew that his future soldiers were being trained there for the Great War he was about to lead. In 1936, this paramilitary organization became compulsory for all children between the ages of 10 and 18. However, it was not the only place where the regime's indoctrination took place. Schools also became centers where children were instilled with National Socialist values, even before opening a textbook. From the beginning, buildings already displayed signs with swastikas and portraits of Hitler, as well as the Nazi flag in the playground. Although some subjects, such as mathematics and physics, did not change much, others underwent dramatic changes. In biology classes, Teachers focused on racial purity, contrasting the superiority of Aryan students with members of the Jewish community. Likewise, they told girls to be selective with their marriage partners, encouraging them to avoid interracial reproduction. Great importance was also placed on physical activity. In 1934, the Nazis brought back the 3-lesson-a-week drill program that had been eliminated under the previous government. In addition to improving the health of the children, the practice was designed to teach leadership skills and provide a soldier's mindset. Geography classes were also riddled with propaganda, with books emphasizing geopolitics, the expansion of Germanic tribes throughout history, and German superiority that was to flourish again. Despite all the preparations for war, the population was unaware of how close the conflict was. They lived in a deceptive sense of peace and tranquility, where Hitler was an exemplary leader.
Yesterday, we followed the ceremonies on Buckerberg on the radio. Once again, Hitler spoke excellently. All over the world, war, strikes, unrest. Here, profound peace. The people know this, or they would not celebrate him so much.
Undoubtedly, Nazi propaganda was doing its job perfectly. And while most Germans were living a good life, hatred towards a small portion of the population was growing more and more. It was they who knew the dark side of the Fuhrer's dictatorship from the very first moment. As you can imagine, we are talking about the Jews. However, in addition to racial discrimination, this group was pointed out as the culprit of all the evils that had plagued Germany in the past. This generated hatred and fierce persecution.
After the seizure of power, the National Socialists are able to connect directly with the anti-Jewish attitude of many resort managements and hoteliers. In 1935, Jewish tourists are completely excluded from the beaches of the German North and Baltic Seas. A corresponding decree from the Reich Ministry of the Interior in July 1937 is thus superfluous.
Despite this, anti-Semitism cannot be attributed exclusively to the Nazi regime, as it had existed in Europe for several centuries. The early Christian church described them as people who were unwilling to accept the word of God, who were agents of the devil and murderers of Jesus. During the Middle Ages, they were prevented by laws from owning land or holding public office. They were excluded from most occupations, forcing them to earn their living through money lending, trade, and exchange. They were accused of causing plagues, killing children for religious rituals, and secretly plotting to dominate the world. None of these accusations were true, but they were conveniently taken up by Hitler to develop his plan. The Jews were labeled as the worst of evils. Everything negative that had an impact on Germany was attributed to them, who now no longer represented just a group of another religion, but a completely different and inferior race in the eyes of the Third Reich. The persecution led to the expropriation of all their assets to fill the coffers of the Nazi government, and various personalities left the country for fear of repression.
In the summer of 1935, Berlin looked like the cosmopolitan city it had been before 1933. A lot of traffic, advertising, hustle, tourists, and bustling activity. The expulsion of many artists and scientists was not readily apparent.
A ruthless enemy had been created, that was being defeated by the powerful Fuhrer. Thus, the leader finished conquering the hearts of his people. Whatever he proposed, he would have the unconditional support of the Germans. In this way, it was not difficult to carry out one of the greatest atrocities of humanity, the Jewish extermination known as the Holocaust. Millions of people who belonged to this group were confined in concentration camps, where they lived in inhuman and cruel conditions. Those who did not die from this were sent to the gas chambers where they were murdered. There is no doubt that this was the darkest chapter of Nazi Germany, but the Jews were not the only ones persecuted by the regime. In fact, any opposition to the Third Reich was crushed. Democratic institutions were dismantled with Hitler's rise to power. Organizations like the Gestapo and the SS were key in monitoring, intimidating, imprisoning, and eliminating political dissidents, communists, trade unionists, and anyone who posed a threat to Nazi ideology. Both the state's secret police and its paramilitary group carried out arbitrary arrests without trial. At the slightest suspicion of being an opponent, the person was simply arrested and sent to the same concentration camps where the Jews ended up. In this way, the Nazis quickly eliminated anyone who was against the policies of the Third Reich. And despite so much darkness, the streets of Germany continued to show the population enjoying an alternative reality.
The year 1937 is the quietest of Hitler's 12-year reign. There are no foreign policy provocations, no new racist laws, no publicly staged pogroms. If one were to believe the footage shot by amateur filmmakers who come from the upper middle class, the people in Hitler's Reich enjoy their lives.
Finally, in 1939, the Nazi farce collapses. Adolf Hitler's true aspirations are revealed with the invasion of Poland. The military rearmament that had been taking place in the shadows has been a great success. The country's armed forces are powerful and are advancing rapidly with the Führer's expansion plan. The Second World War begins to take shape, and the German population that enjoyed privileges by simply looking the other way has now become involved in the largest conflict in humanity. The conflict will leave millions dead and the fall of the Third Reich. The Germans will once again be plunged into misery, with a country totally in ruins and controlled by the enemy. The rest is history. Now, after having learned about the daily life of the people who inhabited German territory during the first years of Nazi rule, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We look forward to meeting you again in our next video.